The rain fell in slow, heavy sheets, soaking the courtyard of Ravenshade Orphanage, where Serena Gale stood trembling. Her breath hitched as she clutched a torn letter in her hands, one she wasn't meant to find, one that spoke of lies buried beneath years of silence. For 17 years, she believed her parents had died in a fire, but the letter claimed otherwise. Her eyes scanned the ink-stained paper, the handwriting trembling with guilt and urgency. It was signed by TB and dated 2 weeks before the fire that changed her life. The initials meant nothing at first, but the handwriting stirred a memory she couldn't yet place. Behind her, Sister Clarice called for her, her voice sharp against the cold air, but Serena couldn't move. The world around her cracked slightly, as if her reality had been a thin layer of ice all along. She read the letter again, her knuckles whitening as she realized what this might mean. Someone had lied, someone who was still out there. That night, the storm worsened, and Serena's thoughts twisted like the trees outside her window. She sat curled up on the orphanage bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind chasing shadows and echoes. TB, whoever he was, had known about the fire and possibly caused it. She remembered flickering lights, screams, and someone pulling her out of the flames, though no one ever confirmed who saved her. That fragmented memory returned now with sickening clarity, the smell of smoke, a deep voice whispering, "Forgive me." Her hands trembled as she tried to push the thoughts away, but they clung to her like soot. That name, it had to mean something. Then the word came unbidden to her lips. Theodore. She hadn't heard it since she was 8, but suddenly it fit. Theodore Blake. She rose from the bed and pulled out the hidden box beneath the floorboard, the one she'd never dared open. Inside were keepsakes, photos, and a burned music box that used to play her mother's favorite lullaby. As the tune played a broken melody, she saw the face of a boy, older than her by 5 years, smiling through the blur of time. His name was Theodore, her neighbor, a boy who vanished a week before the fire. He had been her protector, her shadow, her silent strength. Could he be the one behind the letter? The idea felt impossible and yet horrifyingly real. She remembered the way he used to say everything had a purpose, even pain. A lie like that couldn't be innocent. Her heart pounded with a cocktail of dread and longing. The next day, Serena ran away from Ravenshade with nothing but the letter, the music box, and the name Theodore Blake. She boarded a train to Windholt City, where records hinted Theodore had once been enrolled in a military academy. The city was gray, dense, and indifferent, swallowing her whole as she searched for someone long lost to time. She knocked on doors, visited libraries, and bribed clerks with what little money she had. After days of searching, she found a trace, a security firm run by a man named T. Blake, operating under the radar. Her heart leapt and sank all at once. The receptionist wouldn't let her in, but Serena slipped a copy of the letter into an envelope and left it at the front desk. That night, a shadowy figure watched her from across the street, unseen by most, but not by her. She knew in her bones it was him. 3 days passed without word until a message arrived at her hotel room, and signed but unmistakable. "Meet me at the edge of Hollow Moor Bridge. Midnight." Serena dressed in black, her nerves taut like violin strings as she made her way through the silent city. The bridge was cloaked in mist, the river below dark and rushing. A man stood with his back to her, tall, shoulders broad, coat billowing in the breeze. "You shouldn't have come," he said without turning, and the voice carved into her memory. "Theodore," she whispered, and he finally faced her. His eyes were storm cloud gray, lined with something heavier than guilt, remorse, rage, and something else, grief. "I didn't start the fire," he said, "but I didn't stop it either." The silence between them stretched like the bridge beneath their feet, long, cold, and full of cracks. Serena's breath caught in her throat as she took in Theodore's older, hardened face, shadows curling beneath his eyes. The once boy who made her daisy chains was now a man with secrets etched into his skin. He looked like someone who had buried parts of himself too deep to ever unearth again. "Then who did?" she asked, fists clenched at her sides. Theodore looked away, his jaw tightening, as if the answer tasted like blood. "My father," he said flatly. "Colonel Darius Blake." It was meant to look like an accident. Serena stepped back, the wind nearly stealing her balance as the name struck like lightning. She had heard that name whispered once at the orphanage, in a report that vanished the next day. Theodore reached into his coat and handed her a photograph, edges frayed, the image slightly burnt. It showed a man in military regalia standing beside two children, Theodore and herself, barely 5. "You were never supposed to be there that night," he said, his voice trembling beneath the weight of guilt. "He was after your parents, not you. They had something, evidence against him, documents about a military experiment gone wrong." Serena's lips parted, her heartbeat quickening as she stared at the younger version of herself, unaware of the storm brewing behind her. "And you?" she asked. "I tried to warn them," Theodore replied. "I left that letter, but I was too late. The fire was real, but the story was built on lies." Tears rimmed Serena's eyes, hot and confusing. Nothing made sense, and yet everything suddenly did. He told her about Project Aegis, a covert operation run by Colonel Blake that tested psychological warfare and memory manipulation on civilians. Her parents had found out and threatened to go public, so the colonel ordered a cover-up, making it look like an accident. "I thought they saved you," Theodore whispered. "But I didn't know where they took you until years later." Serena clutched the railing, her body stiff, trying to breathe through the betrayal she felt. "You disappeared," she said, each word shaking. "I was a child, and you just vanished." Theodore's face twisted, pain surfacing like a wound reopening. "He sent me away to the academy to keep me quiet. I wasn't brave enough to come back until now." His words hung between them, heavy with old scars. Suddenly, a sharp whistle echoed in the night air, and Theodore's posture changed. "We're not alone," he muttered, reaching into his coat. From the shadows emerged two figures, dressed in plain clothes but moving like soldiers. "They've been watching you ever since you left the orphanage," he said. Serena's breath hitched as Theodore grabbed her hand and pulled her into the fog. They ran along the riverside, dodging between lamp posts, slipping into an alley behind an abandoned bakery. "They're tracking anyone connected to the fire," he explained quickly. "You found the letter, now you're a threat." Serena leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, her head spinning. "So what happens now?" she asked. Theodore looked at her, eyes hard. "Now we disappear." He took her to a hidden apartment beneath an old bookstore, lit only by candlelight and memories. The walls were lined with maps, documents, and photographs, all part of a decades-long investigation he had quietly pursued. "I've been trying to bring him down from the inside," he said, pacing like a caged animal. "But he's untouchable without hard evidence, and the people who tried ended up dead or silenced." Serena stared at the wall, her picture among others, marked with red ink. "You've been watching me," she said, half accusation, half awe. "Protecting you," he replied, "even when I hated myself for what happened." She touched the old music box, now sitting on a shelf. "Then we do this together," she said. For the first time, Theodore nodded. Together, he agreed, though the ghosts between them remained. Morning sunlight broke through the tattered curtains of a safe house, casting long shadows across the maps on the wall. Serena hadn't slept, the weight of revelation pressed down on her chest like stones. Theodore sat across from her, eyes red-rimmed from a night of silence and guilt. Between them, the table bore documents Theodore had gathered over years, evidence, blueprints, surveillance photos. One file was marked Operation Heron, and inside were reports signed by Darius Blake himself. Serena picked up a picture of a girl who looked just like her, but the name was different. S. Blackwell. "They changed your identity," Theodore said quietly. "After the fire, someone in the system hid you." Serena felt her hands tremble as the layers of her life peeled back like old wallpaper. "Why would they do that?" she asked. "To keep you from becoming a witness or a weapon." Theodore lit a cigarette, the smoke curling in the cold air, his movements mechanical, exhausted. "Your mother had a twin sister, Alara. She was a scientist who disappeared years before the fire. Serina's eyes widened, shock threading through her body like static. I found traces of her name tied to the project files, Theodore continued. I think she's alive. Serina sat back, mind reeling from the cascade of truths she wasn't ready to face. You said the project was about memory manipulation, she whispered. Could that have happened to me? Theodore hesitated, then nodded. There are gaps in your memory for a reason. Someone tampered with them, maybe even erased the truth. Serina felt a hollowness open inside her, a terrifying sense that she didn't truly know herself. Then who am I? She asked. You're Serina Gale, Theodore said, fierce and certain. And you're not alone in this. Later that day, they traveled to the outskirts of Windholt, where an old psychiatric facility sat abandoned and rotting. According to Theodore's files, the location once housed Project Aegis test subjects, people who vanished from public record. This place gives me nightmares, and I've never been here, Serina muttered. Theodore placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. Inside, the halls were warped with mold and silence, the air thick with mildew and memories. They found a record room in the basement, mostly destroyed, but a few documents remained intact. One name kept appearing across patient charts and reports. Subject E. Gale, Cognitive Recalibration Phase 4. Serina clutched the page, recognizing her mother's handwriting in the margins. She worked here, she said in disbelief. She tried to stop this. Theodore nodded grimly, and paid the price for it. Suddenly, the power in the facility flickered on, though they hadn't touched a switch. Doors slammed in the distance, and Serina froze. We're not alone, she whispered. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, methodical and sharp. Theodore drew a knife from his boot, signaling her to hide. Through a crack in the wall, Serina saw two men in black entering with scanning equipment, cleaners, sent to burn records and silence trails. They're wiping the past, she said under her breath. The duo planted charges in the filing room and exited swiftly. Theodore and Serina waited until the building shook with a low rumble, smoke and dust curling into the air. We have what we need, he said, coughing. But we're out of time. Serina's hands still clutched the page, now torn at the corner, her proof that her mother had fought back. Back at the safe house, Serina unraveled the document like scripture, reading every word until her eyes ached. The report mentioned one more subject, T. Blake, Exposure Class 3, Cognitive Training Clearance, active. You were part of it, she said, turning to Theodore with horror. Not willingly, he replied, face darkening. He used me as a prototype, his son, the first trial. Serina stepped back, her body screaming for space as she tried to process the betrayal. Why didn't you tell me this before? She asked. Because I didn't want you to see me as something broken, he admitted. Serina's throat burned with rage, sorrow, and something she didn't want to name yet. You're not broken, she said after a long silence. You were just hurt, and I know how that feels. They stood across the room, too far to touch but too close to lie. Theodore didn't sleep that night, sitting on the edge of the old couch like a statue carved from grief. Serina lay awake across the room, her back to him, blinking at the ceiling and wondering if she could ever trust him again. The silence between them had shifted, no longer filled with anger, but with fear. Not fear of one another, but fear of what they might find together. The document she held earlier still trembled in her hands, Theodore's name circled like a wound she couldn't look away from. You should have told me, she finally said, voice brittle as frost. I know, he replied without turning, as if he'd been waiting for those words. I thought I could bury that part of me and protect you from it. Serina sat up, her eyes burning in the low light. You don't get to protect me by lying, Theo. Not anymore. She stood and walked over, dropping the document in front of him with a soft slap. So, what did they do to you? She asked, tone sharp but shaking underneath. Theodore stared at the page for a long moment, then at her, eyes hollow. They taught me how to dissociate, he said quietly. How to break empathy down into pieces, so it couldn't stop me from doing what they wanted. Serina winced, the thought of him as a tool in his father's hands more than she could bear. I remember things sometimes, he continued. Not dreams, just flashes. Waking up in places I didn't fall asleep. People screaming. Tasks completed with no memory of doing them. Serina's face twisted in anguish. And you think you're protecting me from that? She asked, her voice cracking. From the version of me that was created in his lab? He asked. Yes. Tears gathered in Serina's eyes as she dropped to the floor in front of him, placing her hands on his knees. You're not that version anymore, she said fiercely. He may have shaped your past, but he doesn't own your future. Theodore stared at her, the pain in his expression barely contained. What if I hurt someone else? What if I hurt you? He whispered. Serina shook her head slowly. You saved me once, even before I knew I needed saving. That wasn't programming, that was you. His breath caught, and for a moment, his mask shattered. I never stopped seeing your face in the fire, he said. It haunted me every time I closed my eyes. She leaned forward, touching her forehead to his. Then stop running. Let's face it together. The candle beside them flickered as if in agreement. The next morning, Serina suggested they visit a hidden contact, Dr. Lennox, a former colleague of her mother who had vanished after exposing unethical research. Theodore hesitated, warning her that Lennox wasn't safe to trust, but Serina insisted. We can't do this alone, she said. And if my mother trusted her, that means something. They traveled north to the outskirts of Lauren Vale, where the frost hung heavy on the glass and secrets lived in silence. Lennox's cabin was surrounded by bare trees and quiet snow, and inside, the doctor herself greeted them with a weathered face and unreadable eyes. You're Serina, she said, almost like an accusation. And you've brought him. Serina stepped forward. We need your help. We know about the project, about what they did to us. Lennox's jaw tightened. Then you better sit down, because you don't know the half of it. In the warmth of the fire, Dr. Lennox explained that Serina hadn't just been protected, she had been involved. Your mother didn't just fight the program. She built part of it, Lennox said, watching Serina's face collapse. That's not true, Serina whispered, heart hammering. She was trying to dismantle it. Lennox nodded. She was. But only after she realized what she'd helped create. You were part of the trial phases, Serina. You weren't just a survivor. You were part of the test. Theodore stepped forward in disbelief, his hand reaching for Serina's shoulder. No, Serina said, voice breaking. No, I would have remembered that. Lennox's eyes softened. Would you? You were one of the earliest candidates for memory manipulation. Silence dropped like a stone. Serina looked at Theodore, her hands trembling. What if I'm not the victim I thought I was? She asked. And he, for the first time, had no answer. Serina sat alone by the window of Dr. Lennox's cabin, staring into the snow as if the answers might be hidden in the frost-covered branches. Her reflection in the glass looked unfamiliar, distorted by the knowledge she now carried. The fire crackled behind her, but she felt nothing, no warmth, no clarity, only the numbness that comes after truth breaks something inside you. Theodore sat on the other side of the room, silently watching her, his own guilt a storm behind his stillness. She made me into this, Serina finally said, her voice hollow. My own mother used me as a subject. Theodore opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure if his voice would make anything better or worse. She was trying to fix it, he said eventually. She turned against the program. She tried to save you. Serina turned, tears brimming in her eyes. Then why do I feel like nothing about my life was ever mine? Dr. Lennox approached with a folder in her hand, her expression unreadable, but her steps hesitant. This might help explain, she said softly, laying the folder on the table. Inside were detailed logs, records of Serina's brain scans, behavioral tests, and something called echo imprint synchronization. Serina read the notes with shaking hands, unable to process how scientific her childhood had become. They mapped your emotional responses to trauma, Lennox explained, then used them to simulate empathy patterns for other test subjects. Serina's stomach turned. You mean they used me to teach people how to fake feelings? Lennox nodded slowly. You were the template for synthetic compassion. Theodore flinched, a pained look crossing his face. You were never supposed to know this, he whispered. Serena laughed bitterly. No one wants me to know anything, do they? Later that night, Serena sat beside Theodore in silence, the folder still clutched in her hands like it might bleed if she squeezed hard enough. Do you ever wonder who you'd be if none of this had happened? She asked quietly. Theodore exhaled slowly, his gaze distant. All the time. She looked at him, her voice trembling. Do you hate him? Your father? He didn't answer right away. I did, he said finally. But now I just hate what I let him make me. Serena swallowed hard. You didn't choose this. He turned to her, eyes hollow. Did you? The silence that followed stretched painfully long. I don't know, she admitted. But I want to choose something now. I want to choose truth. Even if it ruins me. The next day, Lennox sent them away with a warning and a name. Orrin Black, a rogue operative who once worked inside the deepest vaults of Project Aegis. He vanished after the fallout, she said. But if anyone still has the original data, it's him. Serena and Theodore boarded a train to the southern expanse, where Black was last seen in a border town called Verich. The landscape changed as the train rumbled south, snow giving way to gray plains and silent, crumbling outposts. Serena watched the window, lost in thought, the folder tucked beneath her coat like a secret no one should hold. Theodore sat across from her, reading a document Lennox had given him, though his eyes rarely moved. What happens if we find him, and he tells us everything? Serena asked suddenly. Then we burn it down, Theodore said without hesitation. All of it. When they reached Verich, night had fallen, and the wind carried sand and sorrow through the narrow alleys. They checked into a nameless inn where the clerk barely looked at them, only muttering about ghost chasers, before handing over a key. That night, Serena woke from a nightmare, flames, voices, her mother screaming her name. She sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Theodore came to her side immediately, but she pushed him away. Don't touch me, she said, the fear still in her throat. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't even know what's real. Theodore backed away, his face full of pain. You're real, he said. Everything else is lies, but you, Serena, you're the only thing I still believe in. She buried her face in her hands and whispered, Then I wish I believed in me too. The morning sun burned pale over Verich, casting long shadows through the broken windows of the inn. Serena stood in the bathroom, staring into the cracked mirror as if hoping to see the child she used to be. Behind her eyes lived too many lives now, subject, survivor, orphan, weapon, and none of them felt like the truth. Theodore knocked gently on the door before letting himself in, eyes soft but cautious. I found him, he said, holding out a torn page from a local registry. Orrin Black works out of an old data vault beneath the abandoned tram depot. Serena's voice was barely audible. You're sure it's him? Theodore nodded. Positive. But he's not going to like that we came. Serena turned, wiping her face. I don't care what he likes. I want the truth, and he has it. Theodore reached for her hand, but paused. We go together, he said. No more secrets. The depot was a jagged ruin of rusted steel and shattered glass, its bones creaking with the ghosts of motion long gone. Serena followed Theodore down the collapsed staircase, her heart racing with each step into the darkness. The air grew colder the deeper they went, thick with dust and the faint smell of ozone. At the bottom stood a reinforced door with no handle, only a scanner and a blinking red light. Theodore pressed his hand to the scanner and waited. The light turned green, and the door hissed open. Inside, the vault buzzed with outdated tech, CRT monitors, blinking servers, and a man with white blonde hair sitting at the center, like a spider in a web. He didn't turn when they entered. You brought her, he said calmly. Took you long enough. Serena stepped forward. You're Orrin Black. He finally looked at her. And you're the girl who shouldn't exist. Black led them into a narrow chamber lined with holographic archives, thousands of documents floating silently in coded stasis. Your mother was brilliant, he told Serena. Too brilliant. She thought she could rewrite the monster she helped create. Serena listened in silence, afraid to interrupt what might be the final thread of understanding. I helped her hide you, Black admitted. Changed your records, altered your identity, and buried the proof so deep only she and I could ever retrieve it. Serena's heart stuttered. Then why didn't you come back for me? Black's gaze darkened. Because she died before I could. Killed in a raid orchestrated by your grandfather, Darius Blake. Theodore's expression turned to stone. He covered it all up, Black said. Wiped every file, erased her legacy. But not before she gave me this. He tapped a console, and a file labeled Serena, Final Directive, flickered to life. The hologram that appeared was grainy but unmistakable. It was Serena's mother, Alira Gale, pale and tired but fiercely alive. If you're seeing this, she said, then the lies have cracked open, and the daughter I loved more than anything has found her way back. Serena covered her mouth as her mother continued, voice heavy with urgency. You were part of the program. Not by my will, but because I thought it was the only way to keep you safe. I fought to end it, and they took everything from me. But they never took you. I gave you a way to protect you, to give you a life untouched by what I helped build. Tears streamed down Serena's cheeks as the hologram flickered. Don't carry my guilt, her mother whispered. Carry your truth. You were always more than what they tried to make you. The projection faded, leaving silence, so loud it hurt. Serena stood trembling, the world realigning itself around her mother's final words. She didn't make me a monster, Serena said softly. She saved me. Theodore stepped closer, placing a hand on her shoulder. You finally know, he said. And now you get to choose what happens next. Oren Black powered down the vault and walked toward them. You have the directive, he said. That's enough to destroy everything, if you can stay alive long enough to use it. Serena turned to Theodore, her resolve beginning to shine through the cracks. Then we take it to the capital, she said. We bring the truth to light. Theodore nodded. And we end him. For the first time in weeks, Serena smiled, but it was the kind of smile born in fire. Let's make sure the world remembers her name. The skies over the capital were iron gray, as if the city itself anticipated a reckoning. Serena and Theodore stood at the outskirts, hidden in an old rail tunnel, the stolen data core tucked safely in Serena's satchel. Around them, rebel contacts whispered through burner phones, patching into compromised networks to prepare the final broadcast. Once we send the directive, there's no going back, Theodore said, adjusting the strap on his shoulder. Serena nodded, her expression hard. He's kept the world asleep long enough. It's time they wake up. Through binoculars, she watched the fortified compound ahead, the Blake Institute, disguised as a military think tank. Inside those steel walls lived the man who had destroyed their pasts and controlled countless futures. We need a clean uplink, she said. Oren's contact said the rooftop has a secure satellite rig. Theodore checked his sidearm. Then we go through the belly of the beast. They moved at nightfall, scaling the rear wall and bypassing the outer sensors with codes lifted from Black's vault. Inside, the halls were sterile and silent, each step echoing against cold marble floors. Theodore led, remembering the layout from his training days, hallways he'd marched through as a boy under his father's watchful, ruthless eye. At every turn, Serena felt ghosts clinging to the air, the ghosts of children used, of minds broken, of truths buried. They reached the security room and disabled the cameras, overriding the mainframe with a flash drive Theodore had coded years ago in secret. We're inside the lion's mouth now, he muttered. Serena squeezed his hand, a brief flash of warmth in the dark. Then let's cut out its tongue. They moved quickly, scaling the inner stairwell to the roof. The wind howled through steel girders as spotlights swept the skies. As they reached the top platform, the satellite tower loomed over them, ancient but still alive with pulsing light. Serena dropped to her knees and connected the core, her fingers flying across the console with muscle memory she didn't remember learning. 30 seconds until uplink, she said, heart pounding. Once the directive uploads, every major network will receive it in real time. Theodore kept watch, his eyes never leaving the roof entrance. The seconds stretched unbearably. Then the door burst open. Colonel Darius Blake entered flanked by armed guards, his presence as cold and exacting as a blade. "Stand down," he ordered, voice calm but full of steel. Theodore raised his gun, fury rising in his throat. "You don't give orders anymore," he growled. "You gave those up when you turned your son into a weapon." Darius smirked. "And yet here you are, still pointing guns for me." "Don't listen to him," Serena said, voice firm even as fear clawed at her. "He only knows how to twist truth into poison." Darius stepped closer, raising a hand to stop his guards. "You think this changes anything?" he asked her. "You're a ghost with a hard drive. You think the world will care?" Serena stood slowly, meeting his gaze. "I don't care if they care. I care that they know." She pressed the final key, and the uplink engaged, sending Alira's final directive into every news station, courtroom, and data feed in the nation. Panic flashed across Darius's face, a crack in the armor of the Empire. "Stop the upload," he barked. Theodore took a step forward. "Too late, father." The guards hesitated, watching their commander lose control for the first time. "You'll die for this," Darius hissed. "Maybe," Serena replied, "but you'll finally live with it." Gunfire erupted, chaos, shouting, and smoke filling the rooftop like a final judgment. Serena and Theodore ducked for cover behind the satellite dish, returning fire as the guards broke into confusion. A rebel signal jammed their earpieces, turning their coordination into disarray. Theodore moved like lightning, disabling one guard with precision and turning to shield Serena. A bullet grazed her shoulder, and she cried out, but she kept the uplink protected with her body. Darius tried to flee toward the rooftop elevator, but Theodore caught him by the collar and slammed him against the steel wall. "You made me a weapon," he growled. "Now you'll face what you built." Darius sneered. "You're still mine." "Not anymore," Theodore said, and turned to walk away. Serena fired a warning shot that shattered the elevator panel, trapping Darius on the roof. The old tyrant stood in silence, defeated not by death, but by exposure. As dawn broke over the capital, Serena sat beside Theodore atop the now-empty roof, her shoulder bandaged and heart pounding. News drones buzzed overhead as broadcasts replayed Alira's message on every screen. In the streets below, protests were rising, banners unfurling with her name, with Theodore's face, with truth. "It's over," she whispered. Theodore shook his head. "No. It's just starting. But this time, we get to write it." He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in years, there was no shame in his eyes. Only peace. "You saved me," he said quietly. "Not the other way around." Serena smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "We saved each other." As the sun rose higher, they sat side by side, bloodied but unbroken, watching a world they had unchained begin to breathe. The city was waking up different. Where once there had been whispers, now there were shouts. Screens across the capital replayed Alira Gale's message on loop. Raw, human, undeniable. The Blake Institute was sealed by government reform agents, and Darius Blake had been taken into custody without ceremony, without honor. Serena stood beneath a citywide banner that read, "The truth belongs to the living," feeling like she was both among them and apart. Theodore stood beside her in a borrowed jacket, the same one he had worn the night he left her as a child. "They're calling it the Gale Protocol now," he said softly. "In honor of your mother." Serena didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the crowd that chanted her name. She didn't feel like a symbol. She felt tired, hollow, and deeply human. "She didn't die for a revolution," Serena murmured. "She died for the chance I might live." Later that day, they returned to the safe house, not out of necessity, but out of ritual. It felt different now, like a relic from a story they no longer belonged to. Serena sat at the small table and opened a worn journal her mother had left in the vault, its pages full of sketches, formulas, and soft, Personal letters never sent. One entry caught her eye. If Serena ever finds this, tell her she was always the best thing I ever created. Her throat tightened as she read it again and again, letting the words stitch something inside her that had been unraveling for years. Theodore cleaned his weapon methodically, more from habit than need. "You're free now," he said without looking up. "You could leave all this behind." Serena closed the journal gently. "So could you." He paused, then smiled faintly. "Maybe I don't want it anymore." That night, there was a knock at the safe house door. Sharp, rhythmic, deliberate. Theodore stood immediately, hand on his weapon, but Serena motioned for calm. When she opened the door, a woman stood there, older, with silver in her hair and eyes too familiar to be coincidence. "My name is Alara," she said. "I'm your aunt." Serena's legs nearly gave out as memories stirred, foggy but real. Pictures of a woman in a lab coat, arms that once held her when her mother was away. "You're supposed to be dead," Serena whispered. Alara stepped inside, her presence cautious but warm. "They said the same about you." Theodore remained in the corner, watching like a shadow. "Why now?" he asked. Alara looked at both of them, and her voice lowered. "Because the program didn't die with your father. There's another, and it's moving underground." The peace they had earned began to unravel like smoke. Alara spread out photographs and documents she had stolen before faking her death. A new facility being built outside the jurisdiction of the capital, run by surviving members of the original project. "They called it Aegis Requiem," she said. "The next generation, more subtle, more dangerous." Serena's hand clenched into a fist. "It never ends, does it?" Alara shook her head. "Not yet. But this time, you won't be alone." Theodore looked between them, the weight of old rage rising in his eyes. "We burn it down before it becomes another empire." Serena met his gaze. "Together?" she asked. "Always," he said. The words were different now, not a promise of vengeance, but one of hope. And for the first time, Serena didn't feel like a weapon. She felt like a survivor with a purpose. In the quiet that followed, the three of them sat beneath the yellow lamplight, sketching plans, marking maps, writing a story no one else had the courage to tell. Outside, the world was still mourning, still bleeding, but it was finally asking the right questions. Serena opened her journal and began to write, not for records or revenge, but for memory. For herself. For the girl who had once been locked inside a burning house, crying for someone who would never come. She looked across the table at Theodore, who leaned back in his chair and watched her with something gentler than sorrow. "What are you writing?" he asked. She smiled, a small and private thing. "The beginning of the end," she said. "And maybe the start of something new." He nodded once, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then let's write it together." It was dawn when they crossed into the outskirts of Cinder Vale, where the last remaining trace of Project Aegis had gone underground. The land here was quiet, barren, as if even the earth refused to remember what had happened beneath its surface. Theodore drove while Serena sat beside him, her fingers resting on a map riddled with red markers and hand-drawn notes from Alara. Behind them, the horizon stretched wide with color, soft gold and rusted rose bleeding through the clouds. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in the silence between them, in the shared looks and sleepless nights. Serena glanced at Theodore, who gripped the steering wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. "You're scared," she said gently. He didn't deny it. "Only of losing this, whatever this is we've built." Serena looked down at her open palm. "Then we protect it, with everything we are." The facility was buried beneath a mountain pass disguised as a mineral extraction site. They entered through a collapsed ventilation shaft, following Alara's map into the spine of the compound. Inside, it was colder than they expected, clinical, vast, full of sterile lights and the smell of old steel and recycled air. Theodore took the lead this time, no longer just protecting Serena, but standing beside her as an equal. Every hallway reminded them of what had been stolen. The past walked beside them, heavy but unafraid. They found the mainframe room, still intact, still humming with data. "This is the last one," Theodore said. "After this, there's no more hiding." Serena approached the console. "Then let's do it together." As they connected the virus Alara had crafted, alarms began to flash. "We're not alone," Theodore said, drawing his weapon. They knew someone would come. From the far corridor, a small team of guards approached, silent, faceless, and armed. But behind them walked someone unexpected, Director Aleth Harrow, once presumed dead in the capital purges. Serena's breath caught. "He ran the trials," she whispered. Harrow stepped forward with a soft, condescending smile. "You've grown," he said to her, like she was a memory he'd only now recalled. "Your mother always said you were the flame that would outlive the fire." Theodore raised his weapon. "You don't get to say her name." Harrow ignored him. "We don't want to stop you," he said calmly. "We want you to finish what she started. We want you to lead the new program." Serena stared at him, stunned. "You want me to become what you made me?" Harrow nodded. "You were always the perfect subject. But now, you can be the architect." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Serena stepped forward, gaze steady, voice quiet but burning. "I spent my life trying to find out who I am. And now I know I'm not your subject. I'm not your weapon. I'm not your future." She looked to Theodore. "He is." Harrow frowned. "What do you mean?" Theodore lowered his gun, his voice full of steel. "I was your first prototype. You broke me. And now I'm going to break you." With that, he activated the virus and threw a smoke charge. Chaos erupted. Alarms screamed, lights shattered, and the virus began to unravel years of encrypted data. Serena fought alongside Theodore, using every skill she'd been forced to learn to shut down systems, disable guards, and collapse the walls of the empire they'd both once belonged to. Harrow escaped into the lower levels, but not before Serena planted a tracking device in his coat. They emerged from the burning facility hours later, bodies aching, skins streaked with blood and soot. The sun was setting again, casting long shadows over the ashes of a world that had finally begun to die. Behind them, explosions tore through the compound, sealing the data and the horrors beneath rubble forever. Alara met them at the extraction point, relief flooding her face. "It's done," she said. Serena shook her head slowly. "No. But now it's ours to write." That night, they stayed in a cabin far from the city, surrounded by trees and silence. Alara sat by the fire, watching old hollow-reels of Serena's mother, her eyes wet with memory. Serena and Theodore stood on the balcony, wrapped in blankets, the cold air biting but beautiful. "You still think you're a monster?" she asked. Theodore looked at her. "Not when you look at me like that." She took his hand. "Then I won't stop looking." They stayed up until the stars came out, until the fire inside them burned low but warm. Serena leaned into him, head against his shoulder. "You were my enemy once," she said, smiling softly. "I was your past," Theodore murmured. "But you became my future." They kissed, not as a fairy tale ending, but as survivors who had earned each other after everything. In that moment, they weren't Serena Gale and Theodore Blake, scars, ghosts, or names from a file. They were simply two people who had endured, who had chosen each other despite the ruins. As dawn broke for the second time, Serena opened her journal one last time and wrote, "The fire didn't consume us. It forged us." And beside her, Theodore whispered, "Finally, we're free."